Let me introduce our guest this evening. James Frayne is founding partner of Public First. He's spent his entire career working in communications and opinion poll research and leads on Public First campaign and qualitative research work. That's to say, digging down into what people really think rather than just asking them to tick some multiple choice boxes. Prior to launching this company, he held several very high profile roles in the Westminster world, including campaign director at the Taxpayers Alliance, director of policy and strategy at the think tank Policy Exchange, and was director of communications for the Department of Education. Today, he's considered to be one of the top conservative leaning strategists who's never afraid to tell it how it is and often tells exactly how it is in the Daily Telegraph amongst other outlets. James, it's great to have you with us. Thanks for sparing the time. How are you doing?
Very good, and thanks very much for having me.
So let's sort of, I guess, start at the beginning. I mean, you can go mad by, looking at every single opinion poll and working out what it means. And indeed, I do. I'm a junkie for every piece of data I can get. But what are the present opinion polls telling us? I mean, Snapshot one today, I think, has Reform in the lead on 27% of the vote, Labour on 25, and the Conservatives on 21. But and that seems to be roughly what we're seeing in polls across the board. Give us your take on the snapshot, where the various parties lie, and sort of and what's it mean? What's happened since July last year?
So, roughly speaking, we are at the point where the three top parties that you talked about are essentially split. So, we have got Labour, Tories, and Reform, roughly speaking, on about 25 points, but with Reform percolating up gradually, with the Tories and Labour gradually going down. And I would imagine that over the course of the next few weeks, what we'll see is Reform starts to establish not a huge lead, but a statistically significant lead over the other two parties. So I would imagine we'll start seeing Reform settling on the sort of 26, 27 mark. We'll see the Tories going down more like into the low 20s and Labour heading into the low 20s as well. That's assuming that things roughly stay as they are. I think that is the big question is what are the polls really telling us? I think what they're really telling us is that there is massive irritation with the two parties, with mainstream politics in general. Um, Now we can get into this in more detail about why that might be, but very briefly, ahead of the general election, voters had come to the view that the last Conservative government, or the last series of Conservative governments, were historically and uniquely incompetent. This was the worst set of governments that we'd ever had, and that simply by voting them out and having Labour in, or frankly having anybody in, would just improve the country overnight because this lot were so terrible. Uh, that never happened, obviously. We've seen Labour stumble over the same sorts of challenges that the Tories were stumbling over. And I don't know whether or not this has come as a surprise to Labour, but it has come as a surprise, I think, to a lot in the media, and certainly come as a surprise to a lot of voters who, as I say, thought things would get instantly better. But it was very unlikely that things were going to get better because Labour were wrestling with the same concerns. Or the same challenges rather. They were wrestling with NHS waiting lists, people's inability to see a GP on time, small boats arrivals, very large scale immigration, sluggish growth, you name it. The challenges hadn't gone away, and therefore the expectations that people had were just way out of line with what was realistic. And I think Labour are paying the price for that. The Tories are still paying the price for what is perceived, often rightly, as being policy betrayals, and Reform are reaping the benefits.
So is that? I mean, it might be a caricature of it, but is what's happened since July was people wanted a change of management, and now more and more of them want a kind of total change of system. Something a bit Elon Musk, Doge, Trump-like. That the initial thought was, if we get rid of the present board of directors and replace them with another board of directors, surely things will improve. Now they think the whole company's doing the wrong thing and it needs to be completely restructured. Am I just imagining that, or is that backed up by what you're seeing in research?
No, there is definitely something to that. So, in all the qualitative research that we were doing before the last election, by that I mean focus grouping or doing what we call immersive research at Public First, where we are spending a much longer period of time in a much more specific location. So I'll send researchers into a particular town where instead of doing a couple of hours, they're doing a couple of days. We're going to these sorts of places. And before the election, people were quite open that this was the last throw of the dice for mainstream politics. Now, that wasn't everybody, but it was a significant minority. And you're talking about places like Portsmouth, Plymouth, your industrial, post-industrial towns of the north. People felt so let down by the Conservatives that they thought, didn't particularly like Starmer, but they thought, we'll give him a go. If this doesn't work out, I don't know what we're going to do next. What that could mean, what it looks like it is meaning, is a lot are going to reform. But obviously at the last election, they didn't all go to reform. We had large numbers of people voting for independence for the first time. The Greens arguably underperformed, but you could see them doing well again. So I would imagine that it's certainly possible that we are seeing a very serious fracturing of mainstream politics.
So what surprised me, and maybe you've just explained it, but my kind of working assumption as a member of the Tory party was I fully expected the total shellacking on July the 4th. And I was in what seems to be an increasingly large cohort of people who are fessing up to it, that when the exit poll came out predicting 120 or 130 seats, kind of breathed a sigh of relief. I'll take that. It's that the Conservatives were clearly going to come second, still be the official opposition, and there was some suggestion that we could spiral into a Canada scenario. What I then expected to happen, I didn't expect the Labour government to be this bad this fast, or this unpopular this fast, but as Labour became unpopular, that the natural drift would be back to the Tories. As time went on, people would be more forgiving about the previous Conservative administration. And I presume there was quite a cohort of people who, in normal circumstances, might be expected to vote Conservative, but were so determined to get rid of the Conservative government, they voted for reform. They voted for another right-of-centre party. I completely understand the logic behind that, totally understand the sentiment behind that, but it's sort of my working assumption was those people would start to drift back, right? You've managed to achieve the result you wanted. The Conservatives have not only been kicked out of office, but have been humiliated in their worst result since democracy began. But the gradual, slow drift would be back to the Conservatives. The Conservative vote share's probably now down a smidgen on what it was in July. What do you put that down to? The Conservatives are still losing votes. People who were willing to vote Conservative and for Rishi Sunak on July the 4th, there now seems to be a smaller cohort who are willing to vote for Kemi Badenoch.
Well, as you put it, there is an increasing number of people that now want system change, and that means reform, and it doesn't necessarily mean the Tories, and it certainly doesn't mean Labour. So we can definitely be sure that Labour failure has sort of polluted mainstream politics, as it were. But to be specific about the Conservative Party, the scale of betrayal that people felt, the Conservative voters felt post 2019, was very, very extreme. I'm not sure the party have quite internalized that yet. Kemi Badenoch says that she has. I'm not sure. Time will tell on that. But the scale of it was so extreme that they were going to be hit for a while. But I think, and this is where I would have a big strategic disagreement with the Conservative Party at this point in time, is that my view is that the only way you can regain trust with the voters is by announcing policy, and actually quite specific policy. Because when you've been perceived to have betrayed voters as seriously as they have, you can't bounce back from that by doing sort of a conversation about your principles because you're perceived to have betrayed your principles. You can't come back with just apologies or sort of explanations for what went wrong because people just think, well, that's just words. You want my vote again. I think they actually are going to have to start saying, as I've said, important things on important policies. Now, I veer towards being much more specific than they currently would. So I slightly exaggerate, but I think you are only going to get people listening to you on, let's say, immigration, if you say, I would, again, just for effect, reform subsection 5 of the ECHR, paragraph 3, line 5, because I think only by being very specific on what you would actually do, I don't think anyone is going to believe you. So, frankly, I don't think that the party has given the public anything yet to be sort of optimistic about or to trust them on. So the public are normally pretty rational, and I don't see why they would have changed their mind so far on that.
Yeah, okay. Well, I've told people to put their questions in the Q&A, but we'll link to a few of James's recent articles in the Telegraph on the chat. And you wrote an article about Kemi Badenoch needs ideas now, or the Tories are doomed, I think was the headline. We're linking that to the chat if people didn't read it. Let's start with the Conservatives then. Let's have a chunk on the Conservatives and then move on to reform. I mean, it often takes leaders of the opposition quite a while to, find their feet. It's, some people say it's the most difficult job in politics. I don't know if that's true, but I think it's more of a clinical shock for those who've moved from government to opposition to suddenly find that getting cut through for their each and every move, announcement or thinking is enormously harder. And Kemi's pronounced strategy is, I'm going to sort of, in rough terms, I'm going to sketch out some principles, going to spend this year or so regaining trust. Then I'll, in a year or two's time, outline some policy positions, and then we'll put together a fully costed manifesto. And we'll do all of this in, on the assumption of a 2029 general election, I guess. Do you think that, I mean, you've said that she should get into the detail of policy. Those of us at PopCon, our view has been you perhaps don't need to nail down in subsection 5, subsection C of this particular part of the border force protocol needs to be altered, but you need to have some big signposts on your general position on things. I mean, two obviously high profile ones are, do you wish to be in the ECHR, yes or no? And I guess attached to that, would you repeal the Human Rights Act, yes or no? There is a mid position there. You could sort of substantially amend it. Carbon net zero, are you committed to the target, yes or no? Now, Kemi says she's sort of skeptical about each of them, but I mean, that's not really a position. To take things which aren't, necessarily as high profile at the moment, but the compulsory BBC license fee, yes or no? You could take those sort of positions and say, look, actually working out the entire detailed policy of how we get rid of the license fee and whether we privatise the BBC or make it a cooperative or have a voluntary subscription, that can all wait for another day. We've got a working committee on that who are reporting back in early 2028. But here's the broad position. Would that be enough? Is my first question. And the second thing is whether she comes out with positions or these sort of detailed policies about subsections of our immigration protocols. How can she get off the hook of you had your chance for 14 years and you blew it? Because that can be the answer back to everything. And the response is, well, we're now under new leadership. Well, yeah, true, but she was in the cabinet for a long period of the previous government. How do you deliver? Does she need to deliver a bigger mea culpa? And if so, how is that delivered? Or is time just the greatest healer?
So on that first question, can you sort of just, I suppose, in my words, say important things about important events, and in your words, taking positions? I think it depends, doesn't it? I mean, I think you can. I would say that on your position about we're going to leave the ECHR or something, that is a policy position. That is a clear decision that you are going to do X and you're not going to do Y. I don't think you don't need to go into extreme detail on that particular thing because that is a clear policy. Nonetheless, I would veer into an over explanation as to the extent that a choice needs to be made because, as I say, people just don't believe them. But I think where they seem to think they can be for the short term is they can just say, for example, that they believe in lower taxes in principle. That's neither a position nor a policy, and nor is it really credible when that just hasn't happened, as you say, over the previous 14 years. So yeah, you can come up with clear policy positions, but as I say, you would always going to have to, I would always be prepared to over explain at this point in time, given how little trust that there is in what they're saying. Now, the question about whether or not um, the public are always going to come back and say, well, you were in power for 14 years. There just is no answer to that question. They were in power for 14 years. And I suppose the thing that irritates me personally as a voter is when they talk as if they were not in office. So, there was suggestions of a few blunders recently where they were criticizing things for Starmer was doing, and Starmer was saying, well, it was you introduced it. They just do talk about as if they were not in control of the show. So whilst I'm not personally a massive fan of the big mea culpa because it feels a bit sort of self-indulgent, it assumes that the public is really fascinated on the sort of inner workings of the Conservative Party. Nonetheless, I I think they are just going to have to be as I said, just much clearer on these things about, yes, they got these things wrong, but now they are going to do these things very specifically in the future, A, B, and C. But I just cannot think of another way of doing it than being very specific.
Well, how about this as a strategy? I'm not saying this has been polled, so I'm moving away from what the research might tell you, more asking for your gut instinct. I mean, our core proposition at PopCon, without wanting to absolve the previous Conservative administrations of all blame, that's not our aim, but is say, actually, in many ways, it seems that you can be now in office and not in power, that you can come up with a plan to, for sake of argument, deport people to Rwanda. You can argue whether you think the plan's good or not, but it's a moot point. Parliament can decide it's a good plan. Parliament can decide that Rwanda's a safe place, and then the courts will strike it down. So what's the point of having an immigration policy or an immigration minister in Parliament? Because, and we've seen in the Telegraph over recent days, a whole slew of apparently absurd decisions taken on individual cases of sort of, you can't possibly send me back to Albania because my son doesn't like the flavour of chicken nuggets there. I mean, it's seriously entertained by a court. You might argue in the area of fiscal policy that the OBR, enormously constrains what you can do. And Richard Hughes and the OBR sort of give out the pocket money to the Chancellor of the Exchequer, who then decides to spend it. The tram lines are set very much by the OBR or the Bank of England. Or the Climate Change Committee seems to me to have more power than the the relevant climate change minister. Do you think there's a case that can be made? We tried to run a sound Politburo. Turns out you can't run a sound Politburo. You need to kind of reset the system. And what's happening across the pond in America seems to me to suggest that what might feel like a rather nebulous, abstract point about institutional procedure and constitutional practices might actually have some resonance of, the whole system of government is broken. We tried to steer a train, but the train was on pre-laid rail tracks, and you can't really steer a train. You can, make it go faster or slower or stop at a signal, but you can't really change the direction. Does that work as an explanation? I mean, I'm looking for an explanation, not an excuse, and say we need to, and Kemi sometimes goes close to this. I'm an engineer, we need to rewire all of the processes of government. Or is that too abstract and philosophical for the voter on the street who just wants a higher paycheck and, electricity bills to come down? Does that just make their eyes gloss over?
It is an absolutely fascinating question, and it gets, I think, to the heart of why people are so irritated with mainstream politics at the moment, which is they don't think that the state can do anything at this point in time, and that is incredibly frustrating. And that's really been the case probably since where are we? When Theresa May was in power and was struggling to get a Brexit deal done, and she was sort of implying that we'd had the referendum, but people couldn't really have what they wanted, and we couldn't really get the deal we wanted. So we were just probably going to have more appalling meetings with European officials, and something in the end would come of it. That's what did it for her, and she was replaced by Boris. This might seem like a tangential point, but let me go with it for a moment, which is the thing that really made Boris was probably a decision by Dominic Cummings, which was to really go for it on prorogation. So when Boris was persuaded by Dominic to go for prorogation, all of a sudden, everybody, even Boris's enemies and enemies of Brexit, said, my word, the government is actually doing something tough. They are prepared to do anything to move things forward. And people were very supportive of that. So whilst, a lot of the left-wing media was sort of lionizing, was it Lady Hale, I think, for her role in that, actually it made Boris Johnson and it made a hard Brexit happen, and it made the Conservatives win a big majority in 2019. The point I'm making is, however, over time, when the boats kept coming and they couldn't be stopped, when the cost of living went up and energy companies were seen to be making an enormous profit, which they were in the early days of that inflationary period, and then obviously after Ukraine, people just could not understand why the government couldn't stop these things. And they particularly couldn't understand why they couldn't cut immigration when we're out of the EU, they're complete control of borders. They had a massive majority in Parliament, and they had made promises to cut immigration, and still they couldn't do it. So there has been this great sense of that nobody is in control of the clattering train. And although there has been this coverage recently about, and in the Telegraph, which has been fantastic journalism, that whilst there's been coverage of judges getting in the way of things, human rights lawyers getting in the way of things, that has not yet filtered through to the public. The public still think politicians are in control. It's the British government, sort out the problem. Now, that may soften in time, but at this point in time, they just think it's the government's fault. And the more chaos there is, and actually the more that politicians seem to make excuses, the more people actually hate them. So this is also one of the reasons why it's so important, I think, for Kemi to come up with a policy fast, which is clear and specific on boats, the asylum backlog, and immigration/visas, because people have to be persuaded that there is some substance there, that somebody can actually take control of things. Because, as I say, there is just this great sense of nobody in control of things. And that's why, sorry, I'm rambling a little, but that's why there is this sympathy for this idea of a Trump-like figure. People don't love Trump, but they like the idea of someone that's going to bash heads together and get things moving.
Okay. I've got a whole slew of questions coming in, which I might come to now. We'll come back to Kemi and Nigel's opportunities, weaknesses, strengths and threats in a moment. About polling in general. Barry Malpass asked, polls are often wide of the mark. How reliable are they? I mean, to look over again to the other side of the pond, I think virtually nobody predicted that Donald Trump would win the popular vote. On our side of the pond, at the last election, everybody was predicting Labour would win, but I think that they polled a lower share of the vote than was predicted by almost any opinion poll. David Peddy asks, polling companies have come in for a great deal of criticism for their inaccuracy. We've heard about shy Tories who won't give who won't or give misleading information. We heard about the difficulty of getting in contact with some working people. In the last general election, Labour had a 20-point lead in most polls. Did the polls make some people say, what's the point of voting? And therefore, do polls actually influence the actual result? If the polls are close, does that make it more inclined that people will vote? Barry again asks, aren't polls now irrelevant for predicting the state of things in 4 years' time? And pollsters always give this sort of, it's a snapshot, not a prediction. I find that pretty unconvincing, really. I mean, if you were to take a snapshot of a 100-meter race at the Olympics and Usain Bolt is 25 meters ahead of his nearest rival, and there's a second to go, surely it's a prediction that Usain Bolt's going to win. It's not a certainty, but the polls clearly feed into the betting market. So tell us a little about the, how accurate can polling be? How useful can it be? And what's the feedback effect of it? I don't know, raising or lowering morale of party activists, leading people to start talking about ditching a leader, or on the electorate themselves wanting to get on a bandwagon, or do the electorate not really pay much attention to what Ipsos Mori has said today?
It's a very good question. It's a good challenge. The truth to that is that it is very, very, very difficult for pollsters to make accurate predictions on the budgets that pollsters actually work with. So the most pollsters work in two ways. Either they have an online sample. So some of you will have YouGov being the most famous of these online pollsters. They would have a big sample of people. They would send out an email saying, "Please fill in this poll." People would fill in the poll, and then they would weight it to make it representative. So the right number of women, men, ethnic minorities, old, young, in work, not in work, pension, students, etc. All people, and this is much less these days, but this was the predominant form of polling when I first started out, which was telephone polling, where you would call people up. It was effectively the same as the internet, but you were doing it on the phone. The problem, as one of your other questioners raised, which is it's difficult to get to certain groups. So it's difficult to get to very young people, for example, that might just be completely disengaged from the ordinary political process, or it might keep out older people that are less comfortable using the internet and things like this. So opinion polling in its current form unquestionably struggles to get an accurate picture at a given time. The reason I mentioned budgets is if you had, just for argument's sake, infinite budgets, you might actually go back to a more sort of post-war form of polling where you were door knocking, and you would be knocking on doors in just the right sort of postcodes to get the right number of middle class, working class, ethnic minority, whatever it was, to build that more accurate sample. And you'd also be having a more toing and froing conversation with the public. You would be asking questions, but they would be giving more sort of qualitative answers. That will give you a much more accurate response than you are currently getting with either online or telephone pollsters. Now, you can either say that I'm either incredibly intelligent or extremely cowardly, that I don't do opinion polls around elections because I think it is very difficult to get them right. I'm not particularly keen on looking like I'm a cretin and having egg all in my face. On the other hand, I'm also not keen on just giving the wrong idea to the public on where they are. So I think you can roughly tell. No, sorry, you can tell who's on top, who's struggling, who is probably going to win. You can probably tell that. I don't think you can tell very easily at all about the scale of a majority that someone expecting. That said, there is other forms of polling. Maybe I would say this, wouldn't I? Where I think you can take it more seriously, which is what do people think about specific policies? So you aren't asking people, are they going to turn out on a given day, but you're asking people what they think about net zero, tax rates, whatever. Then I would take those sorts of opinion polling more seriously. The other question on does it affect the
is there a feedback loop? You kind of,
yeah,
bandwagon jumping.
yeah, I think to a point. I mean, I think those of us, on calls like this, frankly, we're politically interested people, and we probably, as Mark, you said, you read every poll, I read every poll, and a lot of the guys watching tonight, they'll be in the same boat. Most people are not like that. Nonetheless, opinion polling affects how the media cover things. It affects whether or not Starmer's up, Starmer's down. Have they got the momentum into the election? Have they not got the momentum into the election? And the coverage on broadcast and print ultimately affects how people are feeling about, is there going to be a stonking majority, for example, and therefore is it worth them turning out? So I think, yeah, it has got to the point where opinion polling, I think, probably plays too much of a role in elections and in politics generally, really. And there's also an awful lot of sort of, maybe I'm guilty of this too, sort of performative polling and endlessly more complex analysis, endlessly more detailed segmentation, which almost feels like it's analysis for its own sake, and almost like it's just lots of people showing how clever they are with their terribly interesting analysis techniques.
Yeah,
Much
yeah.
of it is a pointless waste of time. Um, Anyway,
Well, I mean, yeah, and that it often generates memes. I mean, sort of, I don't know,
yeah.
Vauxhall Man or Worcester. Everything hinges on Worcester woman. Suddenly, apparently. Well, look, we will breach every scientific data survey, but we can run our own polls on this chat. So we're going to ask people at this early stage in the Parliament: polls on voting attention still matter? Do you strongly agree, don't know, disagree, or strongly disagree? Do they matter at this stage in the Parliament? The only people who can't vote are James and myself. We do not claim that this is representative of the public at large or even conservative-minded members of the public, but we'd welcome your thoughts. What does the polling, you gave your sort of strategic advice to Kemi, but is that based on what the polling is saying? I mean, if the Conservatives came to you and said, look, we're not just willing to do anything to boost our vote share, but, here's a wad of cash. Go and, tell us whether, in fact, the electorate really do want clear policy positions. What do they think of Kemi? Do they think that she is, too quiet, too loud, too brash, too conciliatory? To be trusted, not to be trusted. What has come out of your research or other research that you've looked into that those around Kemi Badenoch should think, well, come on, we should be clearly doing X and not Y?
I think this is where the utility of polling and opinion research generally is important to consider, and the limitations of it and how it should be used. So, my view on what the Conservatives should be doing is more based off, to be honest, a sort of 25-year-long conversation with the public, not a sort of off the back of some polling that we've done recently. I think the Conservatives got themselves into a terrible position by overusing or using polling in the wrong way in the last few administrations, actually, in that they would poll what would the public like to see, and the public would like to see better access to the NHS and cuts to inflation and lower crime. So Rishi Sunak would have a pledge card that would say, we will improve the National Health Service and we will cut crime and we will cut inflation. And as if everyone was going, oh my God, yes, that's just what we want, and you're just the people to do it. The party got into two things. Firstly, just parroting back sort of truisms. But secondly, this is important, which is this endless over-promising, which takes me on to a sort of another big strategic recommendation I would make. The first one then being I would announce some policies. The second one is they have to break this cycle of over-promising and under-delivering, which, to be fair, Kemi Badenoch has said that she's well aware of. But it's more than that. It's this obsession that has grown within the Conservative Party that the state can solve everything. And the party has talked itself into a place where the state can solve everything from obesity to loneliness to the North-South divide to an industrial strategy. And it can't. It's absurd to think that they can do that. And therefore, they've constantly end up irritating voters. So if we were in America and we were all Republicans, and Mark was a Republican and I was a Republican consultant, and we would be saying, we need to say to the public, we've got to let freedom ring. We've got to get the government off our backs. We've got to let people reach the American dream. We, however, are English and we are pessimistic and miserable. And we think actually that politicians are incompetent and can't do anything and can't be trusted. Therefore, the best way of making a small state argument in Britain by far is by talking about the incompetence of politicians, how they can't be trusted with our taxes, how they waste everything, and making a sort of variation of the TPA argument, which will resonate with the public much more than any sort of let freedom ring argument. But it's only by breaking this promise that the big state can deliver that we can sort of break this cycle of endless perceived betrayals, but also so that we can actually start making progress on other things which are A, good for the country, and B, which we think will be good issues to play with the public in the sort of next iteration of that communications. Most obviously, lower taxes, lower public spending, and reform public services.
Yeah.
And we could talk about it a bit about it in a minute, which is I think there was a window for this actually 20 years ago, which they could have gone for but didn't. But nonetheless, I would be going down that route to sort of break that cycle. If they don't, they are doomed.
Okay, before I move on to Reform UK, because they are the new kind of kids on the block and an exciting political story, whether you love them or loathe them, or are indifferent to them, or potentially attracted to them. How much does we've talked a lot about policy, whether people want lower taxes and all of the rest of it. You wrote an interesting piece for the Telegraph that we'll put into the chat about actually raising taxes is not popular with voters when it comes to it. But again, looking at the hypothetical situation in which a political party were to engage your services to try and work out what they needed to do, how much of it is more about the party leader and what you see in them, and sort of if you think Britain is broken, you might be looking for someone who is strong and decisive, as you were saying, and sort of, it's a secondary consideration what their health policy is, or whether they're black or white or tall or short. I want someone who's strong and decisive. Or in a different scenario, you might want someone who's, say, relatively conciliatory. I mean, I'm assuming that was one of the reasons that Starmer was, a plausible candidate to take over. A balanced, chap, end the chaos was sort of their basic meme. How much, and you get these sort of maps where people go, and Michael Ashcroft goes around asking people slightly weird questions. So each of the parties were a supermarket. Which one would they be? If each leader was an animal, what would they be? How much should that be the kind of focus, that it's about the image, the personality that the leader and perhaps the 2 or 3 key lieutenants put out, rather than, here's our immigration policy. Look, we've worked out how to make border force more important. Please read this document.
It's a very interesting question, and the way I would characterize that is, once in a generation, you get a candidate that comes along that can just do it, and he just resonates, or she just resonates, and it's very hard to explain why, but they just do. Now, that the people that come to mind most obviously there are Tony Blair and Boris Johnson, but both of them ultimately were wedded to particular policies. So, with Tony Blair, it was at that time in 1997, it was improving public services. That was the big thing. It was a very clear position. And likewise with Boris, it was getting Brexit done, and then and also attached to that, ironic though it now is to say this, it was about cutting immigration for Boris. He was very closely linked to those two policy areas. So I don't think you can necessarily detach the two. That said, as I say, sometimes a candidate just comes along, they can just do it. Most candidates aren't like that. And then what is it that most candidates have therefore got? All they have got is policy positions. Now, I would say that Nigel Farage is where he is in the polls, not because of his wonderful personality or his terrible personality, depending on your view, but the fact that people know that he stands for, in this case, cutting immigration, dealing with the asylum backlog, stopping boats. Everybody knows that if he got into power, that's what he would do. In a previous life, it was that this guy believes in a referendum on the EU and indeed would leave the EU. So I think policy is absolutely, completely critical. To a point, it can be transcended by a once-in-a-generation candidate. But that once-in-a-generation candidate does not include Kemi, or obviously Keir Starmer, or anybody you can see coming through. Time will tell.
Let's move on to reform. Chris Penny tees this up nicely. Does James think that the swing to the right, both in Europe and across the pond in America, will come to the UK? And if so, in what time frame? I guess if you were to take a kind of binary approach of saying that the Conservative Party and Reform are on the right and Labour are on the left, well, we're already seeing that swing, right? If you add together the Conservatives and Reform, appreciating practical politics, it's not that simple, but you're looking at well into the 40s and potentially nudging 50% of the vote. But what's your take on Reform? Are they now, I mean, it almost might be the UK's the last adopter, right? We've got Trump, we've got Maloney, we've got the rise of the AFD, you've got the rise of National Rally in France, you've got the Farmers' Party and Geert Wilders in Holland. And there are as many differences as similarities, but essentially this populist wave seems to be increasingly a phenomenon in pretty much every Western democracy. Um, is Farage just going to ride that wave into Downing Street?
Um, well, to begin like one step back, I suppose I would say that even though we elected a Labour government, this Labour government is well aware of where public opinion is on a lot of these things. So, the Labour Party did, I mean, extraordinary to think this is a Labour Party which has, recently elected Corbyn as its leader, effectively uploaded a load of videos to YouTube showing them kicking out illegal immigrants. I mean, that is quite an extraordinary thing for a Labour Party to have done. Likewise, they have effectively downgraded the importance of net zero versus growth. It's not clear on this one, but they look like they are slightly dialing back on some of the trans issues. We'll see. But my point is that even though there's a left-wing government in power, there is a sense that culturally right-leaning beliefs are in the ascendancy. However, in terms of Nigel Farage specifically, uh, we all know that it's very difficult in the British political system for small parties to just come out of nowhere and take power, and it will take an awful lot for reform to actually make the next government. That said, it is plausible. This is not a prediction. This is plausible, however, that reform could be the largest party after the next election. That is plausible. Many, many, many things could go wrong for reform along the way. As I said, Farage is not a popular politician. If what the approval ratings are something like Stormer on something like -40, Kemi on something like -38 or something like that, and Farage is in the luxurious -34 or something like that. Not a popular man, nonetheless, because of where he stands on certain policies, they've ticked up. So yes, I think reform could go further still. I think they could get to 30 at some point this year. Time will tell, but they are certainly in the ascendancy.
Yeah, it's fascinating this, isn't it? That I mean, I guess the issue that strategists in both Reform and the Conservatives should be thinking about is what's the floor and what's the ceiling. So maybe start with the Conservatives. Some will argue we had Daniel Hannan on a pop conversation last week. He sort of said, I think at some point there'll have to be a pact because there's a floor through which no party will fall. And that floor is such that under a first past the post, it could scupper the chances of a centre right government. And therefore, at some point, reality will dawn. Do you think that's true of the Conservatives? Or do you think there's a kind of point at which, a tipping point at which you actually just get total meltdown? I mean, I'm not going to put any words in your mouth, but hypothetically, if the Tories start to drop to, I don't know, 15% in the polls rather than 21%, that rather than that actually being the floor, the whole sandcastle's been washed away, right? That there's sort of not much point in hanging around, that people sort of say, well, I compromised some of my principles to be with the Conservative Party because their principal proposition was they're the best vehicle for winning. But if you're hanging around on 15% of the vote, sort of what's the point? So do you think the Conservatives have a natural flaw, or is there actually a point at which the whole thing unravels because it no longer looks like a truly viable vehicle? I'm not suggesting we're close to that at the moment, but I guess a year or two of the Conservatives polling in third place, and that might become the kind of established wisdom. And then looking at Reform UK, you mentioned 30%, but is there a ceiling that is only 30%, and perhaps the Conservative ceiling is a bit higher, that more people who are definitely not in the Conservative column at the moment, but theoretically could be attracted to the Conservative Party, whereas Reform are potentially getting to their ceiling. And, you could imagine the Conservatives, again, I'm just playing around with numbers here, getting 40% of the vote in a general election. They frequently have. Might be hard to see Reform getting 40% of the vote in the general election. And if you want to be sure of winning, that's about the number you've got to hit.
I basically agree with what you have just said, which is I think Reform in its current configuration has a floor not much above 30. Now, that is lower than the market share that a different populist party could get. So I think if you were setting up a new party and you were just going after votes, and you went, let's say you were tough on immigration, you were tough on crime, you poured money into the NHS, blah blah blah. You just did a party which was designed to attract votes. It was very anti-establishment. It was led by a sort of Clarkson figure, for want of a better thought. That floor is significantly higher, and I would think is easily at the 40% mark, and possibly even higher than that. The reason why Reform's Reform's ceiling is lower than that is because, firstly, Farage carries enormous baggage. A lot of people dislike him. Secondly, now, played cleverly, this can actually help them, but it's also not massively helped that Farage and some of the other Reform leaders are seen as being pretty hardline Tories. I mean, literally on the very, very right-wing tip of the Conservative Party. You know, someone like Rupert Lowe or Farage himself, they would have been on the right of a Thatcher Conservative Party, let alone a David Cameron one. And if you are trying to go after votes in the working class north, they are not your ideal people to go for. So, as I say, Reform's ceiling is lower than the sort of theoretical hole for a populist party. Where their flaws are, a bit like you. I mean, at this point in time, does a Conservative Party have a flaw? Probably it does in the high teens, yeah. But as you say, at some point, it's like the old cliche that bankruptcy comes very slowly and then all at once. You could imagine that the Conservative Party may cease to exist. But I would think that more likely what would happen would be a bit like a MAGA/Trump takeover of the Republican Party. That the Conservative Party never sort of officially died; it was just taken over, and it just became something else. There was never a funeral. It's like, you know, there's a brush, but the handle's been changed 50 times, and the brush head's been changed 20 times. You know, I could imagine getting to that position. Will there be a pact? There was a pact, obviously, in 2019. If I was a Conservative Party, I would distance myself from a pact because it just looks like you're admitting failure and defeat. When it came down to it, there'll be a pact. If it looks like the Conservative Party are, you know, on 22 points and Reform are on 27 points, and Reform are polling massively high in the industrial north, and the Tories are doing pretty well in the posh south, there'll be a pact. It'd be mad not to do a pact, but it'd be mad to start talking about 1, 4, 5 years off a vote.
On Farage and Reform, you mentioned earlier that you feared that the Conservative Party, as was, I'm not suggesting this is necessarily what Kemi's doing, but sort of look at the polls, find the 3 or 4 things the electorate are worried about, and then pledge to address them. Do you think Farage is taking any notice of the polls? Do you think that they've got a strategy of saying, right, we're at 25, 26% now, but, you know, in order to get to 32%, you know, that additional boost will be largely made up of, I don't know, you know, young women in the east of England, or people who are particularly concerned about policy X or policy Y. So we've got to kind of pivot into that, you know, essentially identifying swing voters in order to build on, you know, their impressive, 25, 26, 27% of the vote? Or are they just saying, look, shooting from the hip and calling it like you see it, sort of a bit Trump-like? This seems to be working a treat. Let's just keep putting, you know, Rupert Lowe on GB News and Nigel Farage at rallies and all of the rest of it, and decry the state of the world. And, you know, let's just rinse and repeat that strategy. I don't really care if a focus group in Southport says that, you know, people in the Northwest are slightly more concerned about climate change than the National Health Service, or vice versa. So what do you think they're doing, and what do you think they should do?
I think they're doing the latter. So I think they are just going with their gut instinct, which, to be fair to them, has served them very well. You know, I've never been one of those people that thinks Farage is some sort of sort of idiots. He has been a very, very successful politician. Everything that he has. I also thought it was absurd when people would be saying, "Oh, he's tried to go for election all these times. He keeps being rejected. He's a failure." By any measure, the guy's a very successful politician, and I think that following his instinct has been the right thing for them to have done. What will happen, however, when it looks like they are 2 years off an election and are heading towards largest party status, or are heading towards possibly being part of a coalition, they are at that point probably going to have to start being a bit more serious about policy and a bit more serious about what they're going to say about different things, because they're going to have to start saying at some point what they think about local government reform, the national curriculum. So they're going to have to start saying things about that. That cannot be done just shooting from the hip, to use your words, Mark. That has to be done by having actual policy people. And yes, there's a degree of cynicism in this. It has to be done by doing some opinion research attached to that, so that the policies that you're taking on some of these things that may seem a bit second order are still going to potentially blow you up if you get into government, or indeed close to making a government. So I think if I was them, I know they are getting advice to sort of effectively, to use that Americanism, swing for the fences, to try and go for some massive share of the vote. As effectively a Thatcherite party, that's not viable. It is not viable for Farage to junk 30 odd years of being a Thatcherite politician to start saying things about, I don't know, you name
Tax
it.
the rich more.
Whatever. Yes, exactly. Something like that. It can't be done. Therefore, if I were them, I would basically take the Conservative Party 2019 manifesto, dust it down, do a Control F, find and replace, and put reform instead of Conservatives, and basically just adopt that. That was a manifesto which was not terribly right wing. It was opinion researched, and it got vast numbers of votes across the industrial north and amongst working class voters across the country. It was a very mainstream document, which most reform politicians, including Farage, could live with a little bit of change here and there. I would basically just adopt that old position, and don't try and be something they're not. Because if Farage tries to do, as you say, Mark, tax the rich, everyone's going to think it's ludicrous, and reform is nothing without Farage.
And Elon Musk will go even more mental on Twitter against Farage. I think we could confidently predict would be an outcome of that.
I agree, but most of the population will think Musk is a bit of an odd guy. So,
we've got a whole range of different questions about the polling industry and polling and what it tells us. I'm just going to machine gun fire a few at you, James, if that's all right, to polish off this event. John Gardner actually asked about the Lib Dems. I've rather forgotten about them. They've got 72 MPs, and I think I could only name 3 of them. I kind of assumed by now they'd have some emerging talents on television and all the rest of it. I presume they're just knocking on doors in their local constituency and filling in potholes, and maybe that will work for them. But John Gardner asked, should the Liberal Democrats be worried? Are they in a political and psephological no man's land? Worth pointing out, under our electoral system, they won, I think it was 72 seats. But across the country, more than 40% of the total Liberal Democrat vote was in seats they won. I mean, so they had an unbelievably successful concentrated vote. It's not quite true to say they were either winning or getting hammered, but more or less. But are they now just a sort of a kind of political irrelevance? I mean, what's their proposition to the world that would would get a few cheers or even noticed by any of your focus groups?
Their biggest challenge will be, I think, from the left and from the Greens, because I think the Lib Dems have always done quite well from being, a sort of centrist mainstream alternative on things like the environment. They were sort of being quite anti-war as well. I could easily imagine a vast number of middle class Southerners going to the Green Party. So I think they probably ought to head into more sort of Charlie Kennedy territory and start being a bit more anti-war. Makes sense for them to probably be a bit anti getting involved in Ukraine, um, and probably to ramp up the green stuff. And that's probably the best way of them retaining relevance, I think, in a difficult environment for them.
Lucy Trimnell asks an interesting question. She says, I'd love to hear about the don't know responses on the polls. Do they fluctuate? Are they showing an increasing or decreasing trend? Also, what's James's view on polls guiding events more than reflecting them? We've touched on that a bit. But I guess one of the things on the snapshots in the polls to try and work things out, and again, maybe you just end up digging so far in the data that you end up disappearing up your own fundament. But, how devoted are the people who are saying they're going to vote for a particular party? Is it I will crawl over broken glass to vote reform? Or is it just I'm a bit cheesed off at the moment? I guess if those are the options, reform.
The
And
truth is,
the
we
sort of
don't
don't
know.
knows, I hate all of them, which are usually just filtered out, so everything adds up to 100%. But do they fluctuate, or are those just people who are, never go vote anyway?
No, the don't knows are, it's a real mix. Sometimes don't knows surge when genuinely, like at the minute, people are very disillusioned with mainstream politics. They generally don't know what to think about things. Don't knows surge at a time of uncertainty and change. They can't easily be categorized. Really, is the unfortunate answer. There is one interesting thing at the moment though, which is on Kemi Badenoch's ratings. There was a poll recently that YouGov ran about her attributes or lack of, depending on which way which way you lean politically. But it was things like, is she weak or strong? And it was things like, was she weak? 26% agreed. Was she strong? 24% agreed. I'm slightly making this up, but a huge don't know factor. And she had huge don't knows on almost every single attribute or lack of or misattribute that was put to people. And people just don't know who she is. So, the don't knows just do reflect people just don't know what the hell to think, or as I say, they reflect this great sense of uncertainty at a given moment.
We need to wrap up in the next few minutes, but we've got an interesting question on Kemi. But I should just give the results of our own surveys. Just a little bit of fun, as Peter Snow used to say, just a little bit of fun. At this early stage in the Parliament, polls on voting still matter. 10% of you strongly agree, 52% of you agree, 27% disagree, and 4% of you strongly disagree. 7% of you are in that amorphous don't know category, and we don't know how you have failed to make up your mind. And then on the do politicians take too much notice to the of the opinion polls? Strongly agree 16%, agree 45%, disagree 14%, strongly disagree 0%, don't know 25%. Those were your thoughts amongst popconners. Now, there was a question on Kemi that I wanted to find. Cheryl Hennell says, sadly, the new leader of the Conservatives is not cutting it. She was part of the previous government's demise. How soon can we change her out, do you think? I guess that's a political question rather than a polling question. But on the don't know thing, I wonder whether having a vast swathe of don't knows is not that much of a problem at the moment. If sort of 80% of people have no opinion of Kemi Badenoch, that's 80% of the electorate to play for. Whereas it seems to me that on Farage, certainly on Trump, on the other side of the pond, I mean, if you were an American who said, well, I've been ruminating for the past 10 years, but I can't really decide whether I like Donald Trump or dislike Donald Trump, that would be pretty remarkable. Whereas it seems to me pretty obvious that a large chunk of the electorate have no opinion of Kemi Badenoch as of yet. Is that a problem of itself at this stage in her leadership, or does that give her, well, there's everything to play for? 3/4 of the electorate have no opinion of me. My job over the next year or two is to make sure they have a positive opinion upon me.
Well, I think a problem for two reasons. Firstly, as we've discussed, I think when Reform are saying lots of things about important policy areas and they are eating into the Conservative position every day, not knowing what to think about Kemi is not a good thing. But there's something else that I worry about as well on her behalf, which is people are sort of aware that she is the leader of the Conservative Party. Not everyone will know her name, but nonetheless, they'll be aware that she is the leader of the Conservative Party. And over time, they are going to get used to the fact that she is the leader of the Conservative Party and that she isn't saying anything very much. And when she does actually come out and unveil these policies, which she will or she won't do in time, she's not going to look like the new kid on the block anymore. She's not going to look like the change candidate. She's not going to look like this new and exciting person. She's going to look like somebody that's just been hanging around for quite a long time and hasn't done very much. And I fear that she is missing that sort of honeymoon period, for want of a better description, that every politician has, where they can really define themselves in the public mind, really. I mean, we all overdo this in our little world, but can excite voters and make them think about what's next. I think by just being so low key and so dull, I suppose, by not saying very much, I fear that when she actually wants to excite people and when she wants to pull that trigger, nothing's going to happen.
So you do need to sort of act early, right?
I think so.
Yeah, yeah.
Everybody did.
Simon Richards asked an interesting question. This is more about the reform side of the ledger. I'm probably going to infer a bit too much from his question, but he asks, do you think that reform support for Trump might damage it as the extent of his cozying up to Putin, the consequences of that for the UK become more and more apparent? I guess the sort of question is here, lots of people have put this to me, apparently knowingly, that Farage's destiny is intrinsically linked to the success or failure of the Trump administration, and that if the Trump, manages to get America booming and world peace and God knows when spending down and taxes down and everybody's looking over enviously to America, this will be a huge boost to Farage. Whereas if the Trump regime ends up in ignominy or worse, it will be hugely damaging to Farage. Do you think that's right, or
yeah, I think it's
an important one?
I think it's a very important question, and I think the reform and the right generally are making a big mistake by getting too close to the American right and this administration specifically. Because, I mean, let's just think about what may happen in the coming weeks. It's possible that America will introduce tariffs on the UK, which to a lot of British people, particularly of my age or above, that remember, for example, the British reaction post 9/11, the commitment of troops in Afghanistan and Iraq, Tony Blair's, I think, right decision to be right with America at that point. This can feel like a bit of a kick in the teeth, to say the least. Farage will have a lot of explaining to do, and so many of them just seem so eccentric. Elon Musk is clearly a genius, but Elon Musk is a strange guy, and being attached to these sorts of people has consequences. I already think they've gone too far. I already think they've been fawning over people that the British public think are, as I say, a bit odd. And if I were them, I would junk that pretty much straight away, and I would start focusing on provincial Britain. And
That's interesting. Supposing Trump were to say, "Yeah, I am imposing these tariffs because Britain's not played by the rules. I don't like your VAT system." That seems to be the latest excuse. But of course, if Farage was prime minister, we'd get a free trade deal within days. Does that help Farage, or does that just make him look like Trump's puppet? You could almost imagine the posters against reform at the next election being like the ones we had of sort of Alex Salmond with Ed Miliband in his top pocket, Donald Trump with Farage in his top pocket. Or could that be that, oh my God, well, we've got to get onto this American bandwagon, and the president himself saying that Farage is the man who could execute this, and it's only because Starmer and Labour are useless that we've got these impediments.
The British public have got sort of slightly odd views on their role in the world, in that they really think that Britain has declined. It's a basket case. Its best days are behind it. I mean, the idea that you got from Remainers that Leave voters wanted to rebuild the empire and all that. I mean, like, you never had a conversation with an ordinary person. Most people think Britain is completely finished from this demographic. However, when Barack Obama said that Britain should get to the back of the queue for a trade deal, all of a sudden it was like sending the gunboats. I mean, the British public were apoplectic that they'd been disrespected by the most important man in the world. If Trump puts tariffs on the UK, the public will be seething mad and they'll be furious with everybody connected with that project. So everybody that is there fawning over Trump and JD Vance and all the rest of it. Better hope that that Trump doesn't do that, because they're all going down with a sinking ship.
Fascinating insight. James, I'm going to leave you before we wrap up with a final question, which I guess is leaning into trying to get a prediction out of you. Sarah Ingham says, will May's local elections, surely a crucial poll, and obviously an actual poll, be a game changer? What should we be looking at in May? Obviously, swathes of them have been cancelled because of this local government reorganisation. Some conspiracy theories around that, whether that is a really the genuine reason for it. But nevertheless, in this new era, there are going to be polls coming up in May in which the Conservatives start from a pretty high watermark and Reform start from nowhere. What's the sort of, what should we be looking at? And everybody says people play the expectations game, but could that really set the direction of travel for the rest of this parliament if the Conservatives fall to a particular level or Reform gets some major breakthrough?
I think local elections have never played the dominant role that people think that they have. So, don't forget that shortly after the pandemic, when the government wasn't seen to have had a great pandemic in terms of how they'd handled it, still cleaned up at the local elections shortly afterwards. Starmer was supposedly on borrowed time, but Starmer bounced back and Starmer became Prime Minister with a massive landslide. So I think people do forget local elections somewhat quickly. So I don't think they are existential either for within reason.
But do you think this time it could be difficult? I mean, it could this time give Reform a local infrastructure.
Yeah, absolutely.
So suddenly we've got, I don't know, 100, 200, 500 councillors. We're sort of now a genuine force in Nottingham rather than just being a number in an opinion poll in Nottingham for sake of argument.
Yeah, absolutely. So, sorry, I should be clear with it. I don't think it's existential within reason for Starmer, and certainly not for Starmer, and within reason not for Kemi either. But yes, it could really launch Reform as the new UKIP. I mean, I know that sounds daft because they sort of are the UKIP, but there was a period where UKIP itself had vast numbers of councillors across the country and was a real force in places like the northeast. So
and
yes,
Essex, and we're running councils there, I think. Yeah,
exactly. So you could imagine something very similar happening. In terms of a prediction, obviously, I don't like predictions anyway, but certainly not in February. But here is a sort of more general prediction, which is Reform will surge, but also I will be really on the lookout for a mass increase in independents. Now, obviously, independents have always been a force in local politics, but I could imagine that really being a defining feature of these local elections.
James, it's been absolutely fascinating. Before I thank you, just a few announcements for our audience. We've had well over 100 of you on this call, so thanks very much for joining us. Sorry I couldn't get through all the questions. I went for the most popular ones and those that fell most naturally into the conversation. We've been talking about opinion panels. If you, we actually had one question which I didn't get to on people asking how can you become a part of the opinion panel. Well, if you go into the chat now, we run our own opinion panel for those who consider themselves self-identify as being of a conservative disposition. If you're not already a member, please click on that and join. We feed through the information we get either into the public domain or direct to the high command of the Conservative Party. Quick advert, our next Pop Conversation will be on Monday, March the 3rd. We've got a couple of weeks away. At 7 p.m. we'll have Tim Montgomery. I'll be in conversation with Tim Montgomery, leading Conservative for decades, founder of Conservative Home, but a recent defector to Reform UK. So that should be a really, really interesting one. Details and registration on all of our events always appear first in our Friday newsletter. If you're not getting our newsletter, please go and sign up, click the link in the chat, or go to our website and feed in your details so you don't miss out. We do these every week, every fortnight, something like that. Thanks all of you for joining us. But most of all, James, thanks so much for your time and your insight. That's given us an awful lot to think about. Many, many questions, but many answers too for those of us trying to pilot a way back to a sensible centre-right government. So it's been a real delight. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me, and thanks everybody for joining.
Really look forward to catching up to you soon. So that's it for this Pop Conversation, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Have a good night. Over and out.